5 months after the election, the Liberals will bring down their first budget. It's next Tuesday, a week from tonight. What's in it and how the country reacts to it will have a major impact on the credibility and the popularity of the new government. The Bottom Line has its thoughts on all this. Patty Croft is an economist and former senior banker. Preet Banerjee is a freelance journalist who reports on financial matters. And guess who's back from Australia, for a few days anyway, economist and professor at McMaster University, Jim Stanford. Their thoughts in a moment, but first, this. Being finance minister is a 365-day-a-year job, but actually it all comes down to one day, Budget Day, where the country's economic direction is set. For Bill Morneau, next Tuesday is a banner day, a rookie minister delivering his first budget. He's untested, but starting next week, it's game on. No more excuses that he's still studying the books.
We couldn't have been more clear. We intend on moving forward with investments to make a real and sustained difference in Canadians' lives.
How large will the deficit be? Where will stimulus be applied? Which departments will get new money? Which may be cut? What growth projections will be made? And how believable will they be to financial markets? What should he do? Let's get some ideas. All right, well, there's no doubt that he's new to Ottawa. He's not new to this town. He's kind of well known among financial circles. What are you expecting from Bill Morneau?
I'm expecting to be impressed, Peter, because even though he's a rookie politician, he's a seasoned business person. And what's interesting about Bill Morneau is he takes the long-term perspective on everything. He's a pension expert, and in pension world, long-term is 70 to 100 years. So it's going to be interesting to see how he squares that with the short-term political and budget cycle, and more importantly, how he squares that with the focus on 2016 and what to do with the economy now. That
is a challenge, because in politics, short-term is often the way people look at things. Jim.
Well, Peter, I think he kind of personifies the tricky balance that the Liberal Party tries to pursue between being business-friendly on the one hand and having a kind of an activist social conscience on the other. So he'll be the face of that. I'm not sure that his heart is in the social programming end of things based on what he did in his business career. But he's the finance minister. He has to implement the party's program, and so there's going to be that there. One interesting twist is Bay Street, this time, wants a big deficit. So in that regard, he won't face a contradiction on that side.
Boy, and when have we heard that?
Yeah.
Not very often. Preet, what about you?
Yeah, I echo what Patty says, and it's interesting that the firm that he headed up, Morneau Chappelle, is a pension expert, and he's advised governments on pensions, and in the mandate letter sent to him as finance minister, he was tasked with increasing or enhancing the CPP. And so I don't know if we'll see specifics on that on March 22nd, but I think we'll see that the ball is going to start rolling, and we're going to see that there is going to be an enhancement to the CPP. And as a byproduct of that, the Ontario Retirement Pension Plan, which was designed because the feds weren't moving ahead, and was designed to be rolled into enhanced CPP, may never actually truly get off the ground.
All right, let's talk about deficits here for a moment, because a lot of the pre-budget discussion has been about how large the deficit will be. We know there will be one. We expect it to be considerably higher than they had suggested in the campaign. The estimates run anywhere from the high 20s to the low 30s. How important is that number, Jim?
Macroeconomically, not important at all, frankly. They campaigned on a budget that would stimulate growth and job creation, so we're going to have serious money in there. Mr. Morneau is clearly trying to manage people's expectations now. He came up with an update to his update in February, which said even before their spending announcements, they would face an $18 billion deficit. So you know the final number is going to be bigger than that. But in terms of our capacity as a country to carry that deficit, it's not an issue at all. More important will be what kind of stimulus effect we get from it.
Agree on that, Patty?
No, I think the optics are very important, because I've seen numbers as high as $50 billion. It's so fascinating. We went from a balanced budget to economists tripping over themselves that we should be running $30, $40, $50 billion deficits. So if the range, I think, is like 25 to 50 billion, and I think where it falls in that range is very important, but also what drives the higher deficit is key as well. If what drives that deficit is infrastructure spending that improves the long-term productivity and prosperity of Canada, that may get a different reaction. But it's about credibility. You said that in the pack. So credibility could go out the window, I think, if the deficit is too large.
Where are you on this, Preet?
Well, I think we'll probably land closer to $30 billion. And to put that into context, as a deficit to GDP ratio, it's about 1.5%. The U.S. was 2.8 last year and is 2.5%. So a little bit more than half of what the U.S. is running. And that's made sustainable because of the very low interest rate environment that we have. So sustainable. The debate is it necessary? All
right. Patty mentions the spending, and obviously if we're going to run a deficit, they're going to be doing new spending. We know Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland want some money headed in their direction of the tough times they've had with oil. The mayors want infrastructure spending. What are you looking for on that spending area in terms of what could have a real benefit to making the economy grow, which is the bottom line in a lot of all this? Preet, start us on that.
Well, it's a really good question. You know, where do you spend the money to grow the economy? The premise is that spending money right now will grow the economy. Is there something different between now and 2008? And so it's kind of a crude analogy, but if you look at the economy like a car, you need fuel and you need air. So if you put your foot all the way on the accelerator with a $30 billion deficit, it's sustainable. But if the air intake is clogged, then it doesn't matter how hard you put your foot on that pedal, it's not going to move that car forward faster. And that's the debate, is if what's clogging that air intake is, you know, something that's out of the control of the government, then it doesn't matter how hard you push on that pedal. And so some people have to first agree with that premise before you can say, well, now where do you spend that money?
You know, you can't get this guy off the racetrack.
It's always the cars.
Like it's always the cars with Jim, racetrack with Preet.
There you go.
What about you, Patty?
Well, I think we have to be very careful in this discussion because we're not in a recession. This is not 2008 or 2009. So Alberta's in a recession, but countrywide, the economy is struggling, but we're not in a recession. And I actually think that the problems that Canada faces are structural in nature. We have an aging population. We have weak productivity growth. We're moving to a low-carbon economy where low commodity prices may be the new normal. So I think fiscal policy may do nothing for any of those issues.
Ooh, Jim?
Well, I think we do need spending in the short run and in the long run. This is not just a short-term downturn. You know, there is, I think, an issue about where is the engine of growth going to come from in the future.
But there is a suggestion already this week, and we saw it in Renee's item here just a few minutes ago, that actually growth has picked up in the last little while. So here we're trying to add to that growth pickup?
Well, picked up from 0 or even below 0 last year. So it's still well below the capacity of what our country has in order to produce goods and services and generate income. So I don't think it's just a short-term stimulus we need. I think we have to reconceptualize the role of government to being a leader of growth. And that includes long-term investments in infrastructure, as Patty mentioned, but also in human programs and services, things like childcare, elder care. Those are programs that actually create new jobs, that generate new incomes, and lift the standard of living. And I think we have to see an enlarged role for government for an extended period of time, not just a short-term stimulus.
If the new spending is done the right way, in your thinking, how quickly could you see new growth?
Well, one of the things that's been talked about to deal with the short-term problem is in terms of employment insurance benefits. So extend how long people receive those. That's what we saw in 2009. That will have an immediate impact. But infrastructure takes time. We saw that in 08, 09. It took 2 or 3 years. You've got to have coordination between provincial and municipal. You've got to sign contracts. You've got to hire people. So I think shovel-ready is a nice term, but it's not the reality. So it could take a long period of time. And that may not be a bad thing because I don't want them to rush what they spend money on.
Well, on that point, what would be wasteful spending? Preet.
Well, wasteful spending is committing to a project that has no net benefit over and above the cost. So if you build a bridge over a creek that no one's crossing, nor will they cross now that there's a bridge there, that's a perfect example of waste. There is an infrastructure deficit, and this is not only new infrastructure that we need, but also repair and maintenance to existing infrastructure. But I agree with Patty, infrastructure takes a long time before you see the benefits. And the short-term blip of, you know, the jobs created for those projects, that's good, but I don't know if it's significant enough to change the short-term trajectory of the economy.
And that's why you want to see a long-term plan around the infrastructure rather than a quick turn it on, turn it off thing like we saw in 2008, right. 2009, when they went out and, you know, repaired a bunch of hockey arenas and slapped the government sign on every one of them. What we actually need is a 10-year program. And this is what I'm talking about government actually coming to lead growth, not just try to fill in a short-term valley.
Let me pick up a point that Patty mentioned on deficits and just bring it back to that for a moment, because there's going to be, one assumes, so much of a focus on this next week. At what point do deficits get dangerous? Not necessarily the number, but what are you looking for when deficits are dangerous?
Well, in the current context, you know, let's say we go do $30 billion. What happens if we do have a moderate to severe recession in the next couple of years? Where do you go from there? Do you reallocate spending from infrastructure into other projects? That's, you know, that is something that I think then we'll really start to pick apart, you know, how are we spending this money? Because if we're at 30 billion without a recession, what number do you go to if there is one?
And the other criteria to keep in mind are what are the interest rates that you have to pay to service the debt. And the irony is in Canada, our actual interest costs for the federal government have been falling, even though the deficits have been adding to the debt. And that's the dividend that we're getting from those low interest rates. So on that score, interest payments as a share of GDP is declining, and that's an indication that we could borrow, if we chose to, quite a bit more than we have.
Do you want to add to that point?
Yeah, I do. I just think that deficits are really easy to get into and really hard to get out of. So my fear about deficits, the danger is that it becomes conventional wisdom. It's okay to run deficits for a long time. And we've seen this movie before. That's what happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Canada ran 27 consecutive years of budget deficits, and we know where that ended up. In 1995 with a fiscal crisis and very painful spending restraint. And in 1995, just paying the interest on the debt, to your point, took up 1/3 of federal revenues. Today, it's only 9%, and that's a record low. But in dollar terms, it's still $27 billion. And I think most Canadians would rather spend $27 billion on things other than interest on the debt.
Let's talk for a moment about how the ordinary Canadian, if there is such a thing, will be watching next Tuesday in terms of what it means to them in terms of how they're going to manage their own lives. When they start to see the budget roll out, what should they be looking for that could directly impact them?
I think it's been somewhat telegraphed. So we know a lot of the programs that will be announced. We know that the child care benefit is going to be wrapping up sort of a complex of 4 other programs into one. It's much simpler. It's not taxable, but it is income tested. So lower income households are going to see a benefit. We know that there's a tax cut for the middle class and there's a new tax rate on the higher end. TFSAs have been rolled back to the original rules. What I'm really looking forward to is seeing the EI reform. And I think if there's an immediate concern, this is something that they could do. Ramp up their plans instead of implementing what they had in mind for EI reform in 2017, maybe moving that forward when people are needing it, which is now.
Jim?
Although that's going to require some work, I know the new employment minister has been tasked with going out and having consultations and planning around the EI. So I wouldn't expect a big change to the structure, at least not right now on that score. In terms of how it affects the average Canadian, I think they're going to look and say, is this going to improve my chances of keeping my job and generating income? And if so, it will be enhancing to their economic confidence. In terms of the deficit itself, it'll have no impact for their personal investment choices. If, in fact, we get some stimulus from this, it could mean that the Bank of Canada forgoes any future interest rate cuts. So that could affect some of their personal investment decisions, and I think that would be a beneficial thing.
What may be of interest to people is what they do with the small business tax rate. Now, the Conservatives had already said it was going from 11 to 9 by 2019. The Liberals are probably going to accelerate that, but they also have said they may change the definition of what income that applies to. So in particular, there's concern that wealthy people are taking advantage of it. So those wealthy people are people like dentists, lawyers, doctors, and so forth. But in my mind, if a dentist is running a practice and employing 10 people, isn't that a small business? So it'll be very interesting to see what they do with that in the budget.
Well, it's interesting because one of the fixes that they suggested, if it's an individual incorporating just to save tax, maybe the new requirement is you have to actually have employees. So people who don't,
well,
maybe...
Quebec has done that, right? You have to have a minimum of 3 employees to be able to have the small business tax.
All right, we've got to take a short break here, but I want to come back with this question, which is really, in terms of the budget next week, we've heard a lot, as you said, Preet, certain things have been leaked or certainly discussed to the point where we're expecting them in there. But what about a surprise? Budgets often have surprises. If there is one, at least one in this budget, what do you think it's going to be? We'll do that when we come back. And welcome back to The Bottom Line. Patty, Preet, and Jim are all still here at the table tonight for our last question. Governments love to deflect. And on budget days, often when it's seen by some to be bad news, and the deficit number may seem like bad news to some people, certainly the opposition will latch onto it, they throw a surprise in the middle of the thing, something you were never expecting. I always think they're going to do that. So if, in fact, they're going to next week, what do you think that surprise may be?
There's always surprises, you're right, Peter, but I think a surprise could be guaranteed minimum income. Governments have talked about that. Quebec is musing on it as well. It's to deal with income inequality, which is a laudable goal. So far, they've tried to deal with it at the top by taxing the rich more, which I don't agree with. But there is talk about bringing in a guaranteed minimum income. We've got this myriad of programs right now. Get rid of all of them and guarantee Canadians a minimum income above the poverty level, but have enough disincentives so that they'll continue to work.
Liberal governments especially, have struggled with this for decades.
Yes, they have.
Trudeau the Elder toyed with this in the 70s.
And even some Conservatives, former Senator Hugh Segal, for example, was a big proponent of that. So I agree with Patty, that could be a sleeper. The Ontario government had a guaranteed basic income experiment in its recent budget that surprised people. Or there may be something else on the social policy side. Remember, the Liberals still have to prove that they're Liberals in terms of that social concern. So maybe there'll be something in childcare, low-cost housing, something in that area, I suspect, to try and, you know, put the whole budget in the perspective of this sharing, caring vision that they campaigned on.
Great.
I was joking at the break that maybe we'll see the end of the nickel. But, you know, a lot of people are calling for people to do something about housing affordability. And I think the surprise is if they did something about it, because I think if you did that, you could destabilize those hot housing markets. And because housing and housing-related industries have become so much more important in the scope of being in the economy, that if you destabilize that, you can actually make the economy worse off. So it's a very tight rope that they have to walk there. So I don't think we'll see much substantive on housing affordability.
And really, it's two areas in particular that are hot, and a lot of other ones are not so hot or are in trouble. If there's a number you're going to be looking at for in the budget, what will it be, Penny?
My number is 31. That's the ratio of federal debt to GDP. What I want to see is at a minimum that is level, but hopefully that continues to decline over the 4 years.
Okay. Jim?
I'm looking for the amount of actual discretionary new spending that's in the budget. That will be smaller than the deficit because they're starting in the hole, but that will determine the impact on the economy, is how much new spending is going to be there. I want to see between 15 and 20 billion in new spending.
Great.
Well, I would say at 401, when the embargo is lifted, all the headlines are going to say what is the deficit for 2016, 2017. But beyond that, I'd like to see the projection for the next 4 years and just how much spending there is going to be over the next 4 years in light of the context that there could be a recession. And then what do you do from there?
Projecting is always a dangerous game because you don't know the variables that can impact you. And one of them, of course, will be the world oil price, what number they're going to be factoring in terms of all their projections for the future. Jim, before we close it out, you've been in Australia, you've moved there for, what, at least a year, more than a couple of years, but you're back a lot. You're a gig at McMaster, obviously, and still helping out with Unifor. Any lessons from Australia for Canada?
Well, they are grappling with similar issues to us in terms of the resource downturn and the impact on finances. They also have a deficit that they didn't plan on. So far, the lessons have been what not to do. Their first go at it was to come out with a great big slash and burn budget with all kinds of cutbacks, but it was so unpopular, they ended up ousting the Prime Minister from within the party. So now there's a new Prime Minister. His big solution was going to be to increase the GST and cut some income taxes, but that went over like a lead balloon. So right now they don't know what they're doing.
Stand by, yes.
Stand by.
TBD.
We'll get regular updates. Thank you all.
Thank
Good
you,
discussion.
Peter.